9 against the 9.
9 against the 9.
9 against the
9
9.
against the 9.
9 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 against the 9,
9 against the 9.
a podcast about Lord of the Rings.
All right. How ready are you?
I'm as ready as I'll ever be at this point.
We're going to do an episode, and I don't honestly know what we're going to title it. I had considered it like on Supremacy or whatever. Is that what you're thinking this is about?
I thought it's called Supremacy.
Supremacy. It might be. We might be condemning it to that title now, or like we might be establishing that title right now.
I thought we established that episode 1. You're like, episode 7, Supremacy, y'all.
Yeah.
Tune in or don't.
Do you think that we use the term post-colonial? I'm sure that I use the term post-colonial at some point to refer to it.
I'm not sure the listener has heard that term from you. I've heard it several times, but we will define it for everyone's sake.
Yeah, we're going to define some terms. Before the mics were on properly, you were saying, what's the structure here, right? I want the structure to be some corrections first. I got some corrections. I don't know if you do.
I don't think about corrections.
Okay.
I move on with my life.
Charge forward. Corrections, and then there's some intro material I want to talk to sort of frame this discussion. And then definitions, definitely. I want to define several terms before we start doing the analysis. I think that we're talking about supremacy models in Middle-earth, and we're talking about ways that those models intersect with supremacy models in the real world that we live in.
Okay.
Are influenced by or echoed by.
So when we set out this podcast, when we started, we were looking at hobbits as hobbits, orcs as orcs, elves as elves, dwarves as dwarves. Where we're not making connections. We're being like, this is a world into itself, let it be. And now we're going to look at the supremacy model in that world by itself. Mm-hmm. And we are going to make connections, parallels, analogies, etc., from Tolkien's world to actual Earth, England, United States,
Sure. Yeah.
Africa, Middle East, etc.
The real geopolitical world.
Of which the conscious listener is a part.
Yep. And we will be making probably comparisons between the way Tolkien treats certain races to the way certain races are spoken of, certain so-called races are spoken of here in the real world. But you were saying orcs are orcs, dwarves are dwarves. I think that's probably still, we can still retain that a lot of the time because the supremacy models in Middle-earth are, oppressive to dwarves.
Right.
It is legit that they're dwarves.
Right.
They don't have to be a stand-in.
Correct.
But yeah, there's no orcs here in our world.
Well, there are things.
Yeah, right.
There are ways the orcs are referred to
that affect the way.
Which have parallels.
Yes.
Here.
That's what I'm talking about as the second of the two analytical angles. All right. But to kick this episode off, I want to make a couple corrections, and I think we should charge forward. Sound good?
Yeah, charge. Great.
All right. So in, I think, the orc episode, I was talking about the Rohirrim and about Éomer. Éomer is talking about, going across the border, wiping out orcs and clearing the land of orcs and stuff. And I had referred to him as being in the Texas border tradition. And I want to clarify that I don't know shit about Texas. So I can't claim to have any firsthand knowledge or even extensive academic knowledge about the so-called Texas border tradition. I'm literally referring to one book, and it's Lonesome Dove. And I cut most of the content from that episode where I referred to them as cowboys. What I really meant was rangers. You
referred to the Rohirrim as cowboys.
Yeah, the Rohirrim are more like rangers in the Lonesome Dove vocabulary. The rangers are the guys who establish and maintain the borders of white America against Mexicans and natives.
I'm thinking of Walker, Texas Ranger, who's Chuck Norris, big time TV series. Watched it when I was little, but I'm not sure I remember what I definitely missed all of the geopolitical stuff going on.
So yeah, what a ranger is.
It's mostly just Chuck Norris kicking ass.
Yeah. What a ranger is in the Texas border tradition, I can't speak to. I can only speak to this one novel, and it is about cowboys as well as rangers, but the Rohirrim are acting like rangers act in Lonesome Dove, covering the border and determining who belongs and who doesn't.
Maybe like Border Patrol.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, they're border patrol in Lonesome Dove. Okay. Also, I'm always throwing around the term Quendi, Quenya. That refers to a language and a people, yeah? Maybe I should check. Okay, according to Robert Foster's Guide to Middle-earth, Quendi is the elves and Quenya is the language. So that's that. And I will continue probably to make a mix. I will continue to mix that up, maybe.
Quendi speak Quenya.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Supremacy. There's a lot of things to talk about. I want to start off by talking about this this speech that I have been listening to in preparation for this episode. And are you good with me framing it around this? Maybe I should frame it and then tell me if you're like, no, that's bullshit. I don't agree.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so the writer R.F. Kuang, whose work I wasn't familiar with until recently, delivered the 2022 Tolkien lecture on fantasy fiction, 2022 at Oxford. I started listening to that because like a student mentioned her work, and I was reading about her on Wikipedia, and it just seemed fortuitous that she happened to be at this Tolkien lecture, right? The name of her speech, and you could look it up, it's on a bunch of platforms, is called Goodness, Beauty, and Truth, the Value of Art in Times of Crisis. And it's a wide-ranging speech. But a lot of it is about the role of ideology in a novel and the way novels are read ideologically. Written and read ideologically, with an emphasis on ideas. She jokes at the beginning that, like, we'll call it the ideological novel if we're being polite, and the propaganda novel if we're being honest. That's the joke.
Okay.
I want to quote her a couple times and make a couple points about what she says. She says that we, here in the West or whatever, we want our art to send an important message, but we don't like it when that message becomes too obvious. Readers in the West seem to think that they're not reading propaganda, and they seem to not want to read propaganda. And a lot of that is Cold War stuff, but some of it's just aesthetics, right? Like, it's kind of legit that I want to read a book and I can make my mind up, you know.
And she wants there to be a message, but...
No. She doesn't. She's just saying that we, as readers, we want there to be a message, but we get weird. We start to feel weird if the message feels heavy-handed.
So it's like there's a message there that we get to seek and find. Like we get to interpret our own meaning from it.
That's appealing to Western readers.
Right.
In my experience, and I think that's what Kuang is getting at in her speech.
This is like mystery novels where we're like, oh, how I see it.
Right. So then later she says this thing. Very few aspiring writers now would happily label themselves propagandists, and that is probably a good thing. But I will argue that in our current climate, we do a terrible lot of reading books as propaganda, by which I mean we reduce them to didactic, moralistic, and mimetic interpretations. We expect them to tell us precisely how to speak and act and think and behave because we've fallen into the habit of reading and critiquing books solely for their themes and messages, or what we think are their themes and messages, rather than reading them as explorations of all the infinite ways that one can be human.
So break that down into, can you say that in a different way? Mm-hmm. Because there were a lot of big words in there, like this well-crafted speech.
Yeah, she gives two examples too. So even though we seem to want to find our own, even though we seem to resent being told what to think about a novel, we read them as propaganda sometimes, in that we look for a political or ideological message rather than reading it for reading. I'll just quote her again: reading them as explorations of all the infinite ways that one can be human.
So the novels could exist as like, here are ways that in which we are human. Look at all of these different myriad ways.
That's what art does. And
Right.
maybe we, in spite of our disinclination to read propaganda, we look for themes and moral messaging.
I mean, my immediate thought is you read the Bible and you look for specific things to support what you want to be there.
Yeah, or
It's like you'll quote some books of the Bible where there's like an opposite counterpoint somewhere else that's like against the thing you want, but you're like, no, in this book it says this, which supports how I feel and the things that I want to do.
or even the notion that the Bible is a story that's telling us a message about how to live, rather than just like take Abraham or whatever. It's just a story of this guy's life. The Bible's a tricky example because it's so obviously propagandic, or has been used as propaganda for so long.
Right.
She gives the example of Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. So people will read Lolita or critique Lolita as a defense of child abuse, let's say, when it's more complex than that. Not that it doesn't excuse it or anything. It's just the book is about more things than just that one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And The Bluest Eye, she says, we lose a lot of the dimensions of the book when we say The Bluest Eye is about the evils of racism rather than housing inequity and internalized beauty standards, womanhood, family life, all the things that the book is actually about in addition to racism. Does that make sense? And people,
So
go ahead.
if we read Lolita and The Bluest Eye, and we're reading it with thinking like, oh, this is about child abuse, this is about racism, as readers, we are oversimplifying the books, and we're losing a lot of the nuance and a lot of the humanity and human things that exist, like the complex complications of humanity, because we're like, that's child abuse, that's racism.
Yeah. And that can be antagonistic to the art, or it can be in like an ally position with the art. You can be reductive in order to dismiss a piece of art or say it's dangerous. Or you can be reductive in order to sell and to listify and get a book, get a book more exposure.
Right, marketing and business and capitalism. The complexity, that amount of complexity and the oversimplification reminds me of Cho Chang in Harry Potter, the one after that.
Order of the Phoenix?
Sure. So Cho and Harry, if you haven't read it, it's probably had a few spoilers, but Cho and Harry are doing like this little romantic interest, and Cho starts crying. Oh, they kiss, and Cho's crying, and then Ron, Hermione, and Harry talking about it, and how was it? And Harry's like, it was wet. And then Ron says something, I don't know, something simple, like maybe mean or whatever, maybe crass, maybe it was crass. And Hermione's like, well, it's more complex. Cho is probably feeling like guilty about this thing, sad about losing Cedric, guilty for liking Harry, tired for this, like all of these emotions that like she just lists off like 5, 6, 7. And Ron's like, one person can't feel all that. So in his interpretation, it's like, it's one thing, but Hermione recognizes that it's probably a slew of emotions.
Sure.
Cool.
Yeah, so we have a tendency to read like Ron read Cho Chang.
Got it.
Philip Roth says something similar in some book. I'm not sure what. Maybe So I Married a Communist. Basically, that literature and politics are contrary in the sense that where politics tries to reduce things and literature tries to expand things. You take a character in a book who is a Democrat or whatever, and you create a whole existence for that character. But in politics, you take a complex human being or complex socio-political situation and you reduce it to a party platform, talking point, individual label or whatever. Politics is inherently reductive,
Red or blue, win and
Yeah,
lose, us and them.
whereas literature is inherently expansive.
Right.
So those things being said, we don't want to read Tolkien reductively, I don't think. And I think all of our episodes make that clear. I think we're doing a deep dive into the expansive realities of many characters and situations. But this episode is a political critique. This is the one where we're
Sure.
doing it. So Kwong does argue easily that Tolkien has written an ideological novel. It's pretty obvious to me that this is an ideological novel. And I agree with her that the ideology of this novel is heroism, broadly speaking.
Sure.
Right? If we're going to reduce it to like one propaganda point, Tolkien is pressing forward the notion of heroism. I don't think that he set out to establish or promote explicitly like a supremacist model. But I think that the novel is a carrier, maybe an unwitting carrier, for certain supremacist models that were prevalent in his time and our time now to whatever extent.
So a carrier, kind of like an animal, a person could be a carrier for disease, and that disease can get somewhere and spread. Not that it's like active or killing them, but they are the carrier of it.
And notions of good and evil, that stereotypes and their intersection with notions of good and evil that existed at Tolkien's time find their way into the book, and they find their way out of the book, and they continue along here in the real world, and they continue to mirror things in the book. So while the book is wholly fantastical, it is colored by some real world sociopolitical dynamics.
Sure.
And like I said at the beginning, I think it'd be silly to ignore that.
Yep.
So that's what we're doing. We're going to not ignore it.
That's also like the context in which it was written. You cannot ignore the context in which he wrote it, or that it exists in it.
You can, but it seems pretty naive, especially when you're 7 episodes in, right? You might as well take a minute.
Right. And that's what R.F. Kuang was saying. Don't ignore the complexities of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
But she also in that speech is ultimately like cautioning people to chill with the anxiety about ideology and like let ideology sit comfortably with the art. But we don't need to get into that. One last point, and then I think we should move to definitions. I'm a big fan of Gordon White's podcast, Rune Soup, and he's always talking about Middle Earth. And he recently said about the creators of, I think about the creators of the Amazon show. He said it seems almost as if the creators or the writers of the show hate the material. And I'm not sure exactly why. I think because of just a sort of like an aggressive disregard for its sanctity. I think that's maybe his point, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. That they were mutilating it. That's my take on what he thought is happening, right?
Okay.
I can't speak to that particular program.
Because you haven't seen it.
Sure.
Right.
But just to be clear, I don't hate the material, and I love the material, and I can't speak for you, but my intention here is not to mutilate the material. My intention is to understand myself and the world I live in with the material as a tool.
Okay. I like that. Sounds good.
All right, word. So now let's wreck that motherfucker. You ready to talk definitions?
Sure. We're going to lay out definitions of some terms that will come up. So in order to be clear about the words we use, some of these heavy words that have a lot of connotation, we're going to define things like post-colonialism, supremacy, racism. What else we got to define?
I don't know that I have a definition of racism, but
I have that
that's
definition.
good because I don't have that one. But yeah, and also so that when we're using the words, we can adjust them and use them accurately, and we know what the fuck we're talking about. Okay, we're not doing it alphabetically, right?
No.
Okay, you want to start with racism?
Yeah, and it might be more like a racist idea. So I'm looking at Ibram X. Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. So in the prologue of this, on page 5, he's setting out to define these things. So halfway down the page, he says, this is a direct quote, My definition of a racist idea is a simple one. It is any concept that regards one racial group as inferior or superior to another racial group in any way.
Concise.
So you got that, like, inferior or superior, one racial group to another.
Word. Like Kendi, I attempted to define some words myself, and then I checked them against traditional definitions. So I got a definition for supremacy, which seems to do almost the same thing as that definition.
Yeah,
of
and
racism does.
I think that he defines it somewhere. I feel like when I listened to the audiobook of the Jason Reynolds version of Stamped, it's in there somewhere.
So I said that supremacy was a social model wherein one demographic is empowered or legitimized at the expense of another demographic, group of people. And then I checked. Oxford says the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, or status. And then I checked a Merriam also, just to have like some triangulation. They had a definition of supremacism. Supremacism is the belief that a certain group of people is superior to all others. So, superiority. Oxford tags it to authority, power, or status. Yeah, I had used the word power, and I used the word legitimacy, which I guess is like status.
Yeah, there's legitimacy also aligns. It's synonymous with validation, being like, yep, that's okay, that's valid, that's legitimate.
So colonialism, post-colonialism, decolonize, etc., are kind of tertiary terms, right, for this discussion.
Sure.
Do you have definitions for those? You want to try to define colonialism from the dome?
From the cranium straight off the top of the head. So colonialism is sort of colonizing a place or a people or space, except space, albeit physical or metaphysical. So the United States started as 13 colonies. So England came over with people and power, gunpowder, arms, military, etc. They said, this is our land. Now we live here. We're going to colonize. We're going to bring settlers. And they just like took it over.
Yeah, and I think importantly, they exported, right?
They exported from their own country.
No, I think
land.
that the point was to export goods and materia from the quote new world and bring it back into the empire.
Oh, I see. So I was like,
but yeah,
export
you're
from the new world, import to England to
Yeah.
be like, we're going to get your materials.
I think that for the English, and I don't know, but my impression is that colonial service was kind of not fun. Like going to India, not many people were into that.
It was not as nice as, maybe not as nice as living in England. It was rougher. It was quote unquote the frontier. You were quote unquote settlers,
Yeah.
pioneers.
Plus, on top of that, this notion that there's a group of natives that need to be constantly subdued,
Quelled.
rightfully so, given that they probably want you to leave.
Yep.
Not you, Clark.
There's an awkward pause there. It's not going to flow well.
It'll be fine. Yeah, so you
you
were talking about
plural.
colonialism in the North America, and that's a kind of a curious one because of the near total genocide of the natives, and because so many people wanted to stay for whatever reason.
And that is the one that I feel like we're
Yeah,
very familiar with. This is the same land in which that happened.
Yeah, we're so close to it we can't even see it. I wanted to find colonialism from the Dome like a month ago, how I wrote it down from the Dome a month ago. And then I want to back it up with Oxford and this dude named Jürgen Osterhammel. I thought that colonialism was a form of economic exploitation wherein a nation extracts and exports resources, material wealth, and human labor from another geographic area, and that geographic area is understood as possessed by that nation, though not subject to the same governance as so-called citizens of said nation.
Yeah.
It's much too complex to be workable. But I thought all those things were wrapped into my understanding of colonialism.
The listener may have to rewind the track a little bit and listen to that again.
I'm talking about exploitation and exports, possession, and it's something like a supremacy model, a power differential between the citizens and the governed residents, aka the natives of the colonized area. Those people can become citizens, maybe in some
Maybe.
models.
Yep.
If they what's the word I'm looking for? Conform.
Assimilate.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it's an from that colony, you're exporting resources, materials,
and people,
wealth, people, labor,
ideas. Yep. Okay. Oxford defines post-colonialism as a theoretical approach in various disciplines that is concerned with the lasting impact of colonization in former colonies. So I think I'm ready to charge forward into Supremacy in Middle-earth
Sound the bugle
for the episode.
Sound the horn.
Ready to start the episode, Clark, are you?
Let's go. We're talking about the text. So that's a pretty long intro. Seemingly that was a long
set of preconditions, and now we're going to talk about supremacy in Middle-earth and how it influences supremacy models here on planet Earth.
right. Intro done. Let's talk about Middle-earth. What do you got?
I got basically only 2 points, although maybe a third point, right? And the first one is elven supremacy, and the way that elven supremacy in Middle-earth echoes supremacy models here in our world. Mm-hmm. That's a Middle-earth situation, right? There's no such thing as elven supremacy here in the real world.
Because elves don't exist.
Yes, but in Middle-earth, there's an elven supremacy model.
Sure.
Numenorian supremacy. The Numenorian colonization model. And then maybe the issue in this book, the gender balance issue in this book, but I think that that's actually not a Middle-earth problem, as it is like a real world, like it's being imposed on the vision. It's not inherent to Middle-earth. It might be inherent to Middle-earth. It's just like the narrator is ignoring the female characters. Or the
female characters?
The non-male. Well, that's the question.
Exactly.
Do they truly not exist? Or are we just given a privileged perspective that favors only the male characters?
They're like 8.
It's like a book about World War II.
They're like 8, but they're really only like 2.
Yeah, we'll get to it. They're there.
The Entwives exist, but we don't know where they are.
The Entwives is a good... We should talk about the Entwives specifically. I don't know whether we're talking about it now, but because that's a good emblem of the situation. It's almost like... Yeah, let's...
No, you got
we'll
your
get to
2
that.
points.
Those are my 2.5, 3 points, basically.
And I've got a bunch of little text quotes to fill in here and there, being like, here's textual evidence.
You think they're related to those 3 things?
We'll see. We'll see where they fall in.
And then I also have like... things that I see in Middle-earth that seem to intersect with real-world supremacy models. Like there's a lot of stuff about orcs to talk about, getting back at orcs and the way they're described and how that mirrors racist stereotypes here in the real world.
And I think a lot of my text quotes are supporting those real-world racist ideas.
Ditto the Haradrim and ditto like the absence of women.
Right.
The missing, I have written in my notes, absence of females, aka missing women theory. See also Entwives.
So had Entwives.
We will get to it. All right. In terms of elven supremacy, just in a previous episode, like the last one, Legolas and Gimli, I was like, it's called Nargothrond. And listening to it again, I had already explained how the elves had seized the caves from dwarves. Dwarves they referred to as petty dwarves, and whom they hunted prior to their taking over the caves, right? So it's not called Nargothrond. It was called something else. It had a dwarvish name. And my casual... Like, I'll tell that story, and then I'll be like, oh, it's called Nargothrond. My casual accidental falling into elven supremacy is like demonstrated in that moment.
Right. So it's sort of like mountains in the United States had, like the indigenous people had names for them, but we do not use those names. We've named them other things.
It's like if you gave the whole history of the the native name for Mount Washington.
Right.
And you gave that whole history, and then you went immediately and casually right back to calling it Mount Washington.
Right.
It's just demonstrates the potency of a supremacy model. So, and given that like the hobbits, they love the elves, right? They're always on about the elves. Bilbo loves elves. Frodo loves elves. And then the Silmarillion is an elvish history, right? They are the protagonist of the Middle-earth story. So history is written by, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? History is written by the victors, sure.
This is like Roma Victor. This is like Caesar's history of Gaul.
Mm-hmm.
So the only written like history that we have of Gaul is written by Caesar.
Right, yeah. Ditto like the church's writings on the heresies and the various different sects of Christianity that were wiped out by the Orthodox Church.
Also, there's an English panel series called QI. It stands for quite interesting. It's good. It's an enjoyable show. It's comedy. It's trivia. They were talking on one little clip in one episode where they were like, "This is the first time that this has ever been done," or like, "This is the first time this thing happened." And some guy was like, "Well, actually, I object. There's plenty of oral tradition in like African nations where like." It was like a welfare thing. Like you put money into the pot so no one goes hungry. And the panel was like, "Oh, this existed in like for the first time in history in this like white state." And this guy was like, "Actually, it's existed before. It's just it's an oral tradition. It may not have been written down." And they're like, "Yeah, okay, we see that maybe the history isn't written, so we don't acknowledge it. We don't value. We don't know the oral history."
Right.
But it exists somewhere else.
Yeah, and the arrogance and the myopia of saying the way I'm doing things is the legitimate way. To write it down, to document it, to create a deed, a record.
Well, did you sign it? Your signature is there. Does your signature count for anything? If you don't sign it,
as though like the spoken word were less legitimate as a method.
Correct.
It's not because paper is more legit. It's because the colonizer uses paper and the colonized uses the spoken word.
Right.
Okay, so I don't know that I have quotes to support the elven supremacy, and I think we did it in the Legolas Gimli episode.
Sure.
You feel me? We talked a lot about that situation.
Yeah.
The children of Iluvatar, the firstborn. Right? They get their special they get their special land.
So there is evidence of, do you want to do a parallel? Because I've got some quotes about elves being called the fairest folk. This is talking about...
Yeah, so what you're getting at this notion that elven supremacy in Middle-earth mirrors white supremacy in our world, in the so-called West or whatever.
Elves are for sure white people.
You're saying they're depicted as white.
Their skin is white.
Sure.
Caucasian, however you want to say it.
Is that 100% in Middle-earth? Is that true in Middle-earth? I don't know. That's my sense.
It's the sense, and I think there was backlash against the Rings of Power because of that understanding.
Mm-hmm.
That Rings of Power shows elves of color.
Okay, and you wanted to talk more about that? You got quotes that show that elves are white dudes.
Yeah. So
the white elf situation.
Right. So on Fellowship of the Ring, my page 89, they're singing a song, the fair elven tongue, blah, 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 blah. It starts, Snow White, O lady clear, O queen beyond the western seas. I think this is like Gilthoniel, O Elbereth, but Snow White, we sing to thee. So it's clear that being fair, this like person that songs are about, is Snow White. And the elves are called the fairest folk on that same page. So this is another song Talking about an elven maid, Nimrodel. Nimrodel. Did you hear the voice of Nimrodel? So there's a song about Nimrodel, and the third stanza of the song, her hair was long, her limbs were white, and fair she was and free. And in the wind she went as light as leaf of linden tree.
It sounds
white limbs, and she was fair.
Mm-hmm. We get a lot of that stuff in Shakespeare too, and I think what you're getting at is a European beauty standard of
Sure.
paleness, right?
Right.
Which I think is also a class concern. I've heard this argument made that
I think I know where you're getting. I've probably heard that too.
like people staying in the house all day rather than working in a field, and having super pale skin, being super delicate because
Right.
you never have to do anything. It's kind of like like almost like culinary, like the flesh of an animal that has not been allowed to move or
Like
see
veal.
light. Yeah.
So then, and like you're very delicate, and you can hold someone's hands, like, oh, how soft your hands are.
Mhm.
But you also get the counterpoint to that might be like, oh, you've never worked a day in your life. So there's like a different value there that you can work with your hands.
I'm not trying to let the class critique get in the way of a race of like a race critique either. I agree that there's like a white black, good evil distinction that is skin color related in this book
For sure.
and I want to get at that a little more when we talk about the depiction of orcs,
Right.
and orcs in contrast and contradistinction to certain types of men, certain types of elves or whatever. So I agree, it's there. Elves are white, and that models your point is that elves are white, and that mirrors a white supremacy model here in our geopolitical world, right?
Yes.
You got more on that, or you want to talk about Numenorians?
So I got another one for elves when this is when the Sam, Frodo, I think Merry and Pippin, are they there at this point? So this is in the chapter 3's company of the Fellowship. This is towards the end of the chapter. They're talking with Gildor, and Gildor is like counseling them at nighttime or whatever. And like, there's a paragraph. Is it indeed? Laughed Gildor. Elves seldom give unguarded advice. For advice is a dangerous gift to give. Yada, yada, yada. He goes on to say, now you should be grateful, for I do not give counsel gladly. As if like these hobbits, these little wander travelers, should be grateful that Gildor, this high, mighty elf, has even stopped and given them time of day to even talk to them. That they're so good that you should be grateful that I've even acknowledged you and your existence. Sort of my interpretation from that.
Yeah, I think that's typical elf talk.
Right.
We heard, I forget his name already, but the dude in our last episode, we were talking about the way some elven kings have spoken to dwarven smiths and, with a haughtiness.
Yeah, and this is also like when they're in Lothlorien, the elves that are like, well, Gimli, like you have to be blindfolded. We've let you go so far. Like, these are the rules. And also Galadriel's husband, who was like, basically like, you're an animal, Gimli, shut up. And
they're like, we've already bent the rules more than we
Right.
normally do, right? That gets back to this notion of that Osterhamel's notion about convinced of their own superiority and their ordained mandate to rule.
Yep.
That's the haughtiness in elves.
Yes.
They always assume that they are ordained to rule.
Which is interesting because their land, their indigenous land is way over the Western Sea.
Well, it's not. That's not their indigenous land. Their indigenous land is Middle Earth. They were invited.
That is their indigenous land.
They were invited to leave and come. So,
But then they left.
they left and came back.
Then they came back. But
Yep.
then they're all leaving again.
Mm-hmm.
They're leaving
Yeah.
Middle Earth. So in the Rings of Power, the show that you haven't seen, they're talking about the Second Age and this war. It seems like they're living in a different place, and they're coming back to fight Morgoth, Sauron, and they're like, well, now I have to go back to the place where we aren't living to control it. And they set up watchtowers and military positions to rule, to like be on guard for thousands of years.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's like a military occupation.
Yeah,
Seemingly.
no one comes back from Valinor in the Second Age in Tolkien, as far as I know. But I can't speak to the show. But the coming and going thing is colonial thinking, right? Like there is a notion of being a warden of an area that is not really. You're not trying to stay there. You just need to keep it together there because there's something there that you need to extract still.
And that's
gotta get those
yeah.
jewels back. Got to get all that mithril out.
Yep. And I want to talk about mithril in terms of supremacy too.
Mm-hmm. Word. Okay.
This is a good time for that mithril quote.
Well, is it about elves or is it about Numenor or is it about?
No, it's about mithril and the value of it. So when Gandalf, they're in Moria. They mention the mithril coat, and Gimli's like, "Oh, that's a kingly gift indeed." And Gandalf says, page 357 of the Fellowship, and he said like something I didn't tell Bilbo, but quote, "Its worth was greater than the value of the whole Shire and everything in it." And I was like, okay, so this thing that like an elven prince was made for an elven prince long ago, like a child. Because it's small, is made of mithril, and it's worth more than this whole section of land, every material thing in it, and the people,
yeah,
and their lives.
Yep, that's definitely
for one little coat that a elven prince wears.
Yeah, that's
for not his whole
mindset,
life.
Right? That's definitely a colonizer mindset.
Mm.
The point is to reduce stuff to economic value.
Right. That's definitely economic.
Whereas, like, people can't be reduced to economic value inherently.
Right. Yeah.
It's not as easy as... Yeah, good.
So there was this... I was listening to this radio story somewhere that this guy was wrongfully imprisoned for, like, 20 years. 20 years, 30 years, whatever. He went in, maybe he was 20, maybe it was 40 years he was in, and he's out when he's 60 or something. And they're like, sorry, we were wrong with DNA testing.
Yeah,
Turns out you were innocent the whole time. We're going to have a settlement. Here's, like, $20 million. Maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was $60 million. And some people are like, oh yeah, that should be fine. I mean, that's like more than $1 million a year.
Right,
That's
yeah.
like what a great thing. But they asked the question, like, how much is enough to compensate for that time? And he's like, there is no compensation.
Right,
like
paradoxical
it doesn't matter because you lose your whole your whole youth, your whole prime of life, and you're forced to comply in this horrible system of prison, so you can't make up for it by just paying your way out.
Yeah. So one takeaway that I'm getting from this is that the equation of a human life, or even stuff, to a number of money, a money number, that's a colonizer mindset, and it's imposed by a minority. It's not the inherent majority position. We don't inherently, as human beings, think that. It's just a mindset, and it's a colonizer mindset. It takes as foundational the notion that the area is an economic, like it's just a thing from which to extract value.
That worth and value are monetary.
Yeah,
are money.
and that they can be calculated.
And
yeah.
it's like what we use now is paper money,
Yes.
but like it doesn't mean anything. But we backed it up with gold. But like, what is gold?
The implication
you can't eat that either.
The implication being that all of this is rational because the colonizer is rational, but it's not rational because it's a minority position.
Yeah, it's all kind of made up.
It's not inherently like it's not a default human position.
Right.
Okay. Which is refreshing to know that it's not inherent. We can get out of that mindset. Numenorian supremacy. I don't know. We've talked a bit about it before. The big signifiers of it in Lord of the Ring, right, are the automatic assumption by everyone that Aragorn is the rightful king because of his lineage. You feel me?
Right.
Aragorn,
he's descended from Isildur.
Yeah, and I only have one quote that points to the supremacy of the Numenorians in relation to the indigenous people of Middle-earth. And I will mention that, but I see you're looking through your notes.
Yeah, so I have things to mention about Numenorians, and in that way, like men.
What do you mean men?
Men,
Because
as in, like the race of men as opposed to the race of elves or the race of
right,
dwarves.
but not all men are Numenorians. That's
Right.
an important distinction, I think, that I'm trying to make.
I think all the quotes I have are Numenorian or relating to others. People from Gondor, they're descended from Numenorian.
Yeah,
the
Gondor
men
is
of the West.
what remains of a Numenorian colonizer state, right? The other thing that's tricky about Numenor as a colonizer state is that the island of Numenor, the imperial capital, is destroyed. So there is no return. You can never go back to London. It's gone, right? You're stranded in the New World.
That makes...
and the New World is the Old World because your people, thousands of years ago, came from there. Because the Numenorians were given Numenor by the gods. They're like, the righteous few men from the first age. So that's how that goes down, right? In
so
the
if they're
first
given Numenor by the gods, did the gods take it away?
Yeah, they did.
Through a flood.
You'll find out when you finish your Amazon show.
All right, so there's a couple of easy physical supremacy things where it starts with Strider in The Prancing Pony, where he's talking to Frodo, he's talking about the ring, and he says on page 194 of Fellowship, "If I was after the ring, I could have it now." And he stands up and why is he so aggressive like that? And he's threatening Frodo, if I wanted it, I could take it.
Yeah.
I am physically superior to you. And
Ordained. He's ordained.
He's ordained. He's the rightful king. Boromir does the same thing at the end of the book. I think it's the Breaking of the Fellowship, where he's like, it should be mine. Give it to me. And he tries to take the ring from. He does try to take it. At which point Frodo puts it on and slips away invisibly. Mm-hmm. And Faramir also in the Two Towers does a similar thing. So these Numenorian descendants are all yo, little hobbit halfling dude, we're better than you. We could take it from you. Mm-hmm. We're not gonna, but we could. And Faramir stands up as soon as he learns what it was. It got all weird. It got tense. Sam and Frodo stood up, put their backs against the wall, put their hands on their sword hilts, being like, is this guy going to come after us? All the other talking in the cave stopped. They all looked over what's this tense thing going on over there, Faramir?
So what you're talking about reminds me of a supremacist model that both you and I are very familiar with. It gets spoken of infrequently, and it's the sort of adult-child supremacist model. What you just described is very much like the way a flustered reactionary teacher can behave when fronted on. I am ultimately the one in charge here, and my will is law, whereas yours is not.
Right.
I am doing you a service by not being aggressive and taking or doing or imposing.
Right. I could take your phone by all right. I could give you detention.
Fucking bring up the phone, man. It did flash through my mind, but because phones are tricky because they're not some sort of liberatory device. But yeah,
right.
Yeah. I mean, but
I could give you detention and make you stay for take 30 minutes of your time after school.
Even if that's not true, the notion of being ordained to rule.
Yeah.
And also the cowardice of it, too. The anxiety that underlies such a move in the classroom. Because one feels so threatened by
your own vulnerability and insecurities.
Yeah, so threatened by the dynamic that one feels like they need to fall back into their ordainment rather than the condition of the situation. There's a real situation happening between two people, and rather than confront it, and the differentials there, I'll fall back on this legalistic notion that I'm ordained to rule.
In loco parentis, also I have a master's degree of education.
Sure,
I know more than you do. I know what's better for you. Oh snap! That's the next quote.
In elementary school, that also it has the same size differential that we're seeing in this book. They're men, 6 feet tall or whatever, and these hobbits are 4'2".
So Faramir also does this thing. Let me find the quote here. This is in the Two Towers. This is in that same scene well, no, this isn't before. This is Two Towers, page 311, where Faramir's talking to Frodo and Sam, and he says, "I will decide what is best for me to do, and for you. I will decide what's best for me, and I will decide what's best for you. You do not have autonomy. I have power over you,
Yeah.
child."
I'm the patron.
Yeah.
You're my ward.
This is like mother knows best, father knows best, teacher knows best.
Yep. Okay. And these are adjacent to the Numenorian concerns.
Because they are of
Right.
Numenorian descent. They're of that culture.
I've got one quote about Numenorian supremacy in contrast to the behavior of the indigenous people of Middle Earth, but you got something else. This is the one that I've got is gonna move us into some talk about other stuff.
So I got another one about Faramir, this whole thing. So Faramir, as he's talking with Sam and Frodo, he says, "I know what's best for you. I will decide." He said, "I could take the ring. I do have physical dominance and superiority. I could do that, but I won't." And Sam's like, at one point, Sam becomes very humble. He starts begging, like, "Oh, please, Mr. Faramir, sir, don't take the ring. Show your quality. This is a chance to prove your quality." So when Faramir doesn't do these things, like, he gets this praise from Sam, like, "You have shown your quality, quote, the very highest. Like, you have shown the supreme
You've demonstrated
quality,
why you're supreme,
even though you have like taken us prisoner, captured us, moved us here against our will. We didn't want to go with you, but you blindfolded us, you moved us here, you threatened us with your posturing, and that is the highest quality."
Yeah, you know what's wild about this is that the same dynamic exists between Sam and Gollum. Gollum with the like, "Good master" stuff.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The begging and the bowing and the scraping and the groveling in order to gain favor with a character called Master.
Right.
And Sam, in his arbitrary tyranny, lording it over Gollum occasionally. Now in the same position, or in the inverse position with Faramir.
Right.
Passing on that. So that's another thing about this, the passing on of supremacy models and the passing on of abuse models.
So another thing about Faramir, I'm going to go to the text here. This is a little more, it's not as direct a quote. Page 314, the window in the west. This is the bottom paragraph on 314. He's mentioning slaves. He's mentioning the white tree. So there's a beautiful queen among other queens, not a mistress of many slaves, nay, not even a kind mistress of willing slaves. So he brings us the idea that slaves can be willing, like willingly enslaved, like better for being slaves. And this
This
is
is
with
Faramir?
this is Faramir saying this.
Who's he talking about?
I don't really know. I mean, I found this and I just like came out and I'm like, what?
I know,
That's some Ibramex Kendi shit. That's some stamped. That's some like. There's simulationists. There's anti-racists. Like that's like definite racist shit right there.
Willing slave.
A slave that you can.
Yeah,
that's
a
a person can
oxymoron,
be enslaved
right.
and do so willingly and be better for being enslaved.
Sure. Yeah. Willing
And this
slaves.
notion still exists today that, we did, like, the master and slaves in America were, like, the slaves were often better off for it. They were treated as family.
Yeah. Once again, a colonizer mindset. I'm not going to synthesize what the indigenous population actually thinks. I'm going to impose a notion of my ordained supremacy on the world, on my understanding of the world.
And
but I do want to know who he's talking about because it's one of our mysterious, fewer than 10 female characters. He's using she, right?
He's using she. He was also talking about, he's alluding to the ring before he knows it exists, and he says, "But fear no more, I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway, not where Minas Tirith falling in ruin, and I alone could save her." So using the weapon of the Dark Lord for her for her good and my glory. No, I do not wish for such triumphs, Frodo, son of Drogo. Neither did the council, said Frodo, nor do I. I would have nothing to do with such matters. For myself, said Faramir, I would see the white tree in flower again in the courts of the kings, and the silver crown return, and Minas Tirith in peace. Minas Anor again as of old, full of light, fair and high, beautiful as a queen among other queens, not a mistress of many slaves, nay, not even a kind mistress of willing slaves. War must be while we defend our lives.
Not
against,
even a kind.
Not even.
He does.
So maybe this is like maybe
so
this is some
Faramir
anti-racism.
Faramir won't even accept that condition.
Right.
He's talking about Minas Arnor.
Minas
right?
Anor.
So
yeah.
he's saying, I want it to be deslavified.
So maybe that's like this
unenslaved.
this anti-racist theory from Faramir, but like it shows that idea of willing slaves exists within
it does,
Númenórean
but maybe it's not.
culture.
Faramir seems to maybe not be favoring it in this particular moment. He seems to. It's almost like that's one of Sauron's moves is to make quote willing slaves, people who believe their will. I mean, because such a condition of psychological enslavement. Often people don't know they've been psychologically manipulated until after the event, right? In cults and such. So, in the cult of Sauron, people might perceive themselves as being cooperating when in retrospect they realize they were psychologically enslaved.
I'm going to make a reference to one of your favorite topics, like that willing, like psychological thing of cell phones. Like you willingly participate,
Sure.
but you're roped into this thing and they get you to come, the phone gets you to turn it on 100 times a day and like come back to it, and that's control. It's controlling. That's psychological control.
That's the Brave New World dystopia versus the Orwellian 1984 dystopia. In the Huxley edition, you like it. You like being a beta or an alpha or whatever, and you like doing soma and doing all this, having this stuff.
Right.
And in 1984, you are scared of your government and you fear them and you submit.
And
But
you
they're
don't
both.
do it.
You don't. Right. You don't do
have
what they
those-
say not to do. You don't know. You don't have any benefits.
Right.
You just have coercion. But you have coercion either way. It's like the stick and the carrot. The stick is 1984, and the carrot is Brave New World. The notion of a willing slave, which is oxymoronic, that's a carrot dystopia.
Yeah. But this idea of like the willing slave it seems to exist in Númenórean culture passed down because Faramir he mentions it.
Sure.
It's the only time it's
in his
mentioned.
vocabulary.
Right. So let's go to the Two Towers, the Road to Isengard, page 174. The narrator's describing Isengard and the tower and the area surrounding it. This is while it's occupied by Sauron, while he's using it to engage and produce weapons of war. Sauron has enslaved people who are working there. He's got orcs working there. He doesn't trust the orcs to be on guard, I believe, so he has men on guard. But this is a paragraph on that page describing Isengard. Many houses there were, chambers, halls, and passages, cut and tunneled back into the walls upon their inner side, so that all the open circle was overlooked by countless windows and dark doors. Thousands could dwell there, workers, servants, slaves, and warriors with great store of arms. Wolves were fed and stabled in deep dens beneath. So what struck me was the fact that slaves is just like thrown in there so casually. So thousands could dwell there, including slaves, sort of like if you tour a plantation where like a plantation in the south of the United States, you might be like, oh, over here are the barns and this is where the livestock were grown. And on the right, you can like through the woods out of sight, there are the slave quarters. But look at the lovely architecture of this, like the manor house,
Yeah.
where it's just casually mentioned. But so slaves can dwell there. It doesn't mention that it doesn't say Sauron
is
made
enslaving
this-
people in this
right.
room.
It doesn't say that. So like, were there slave quarters? Did slaves live there in Númenórean times?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good.
It's vague. It's unclear.
The question, broadly speaking, is did the Numenorians have an enslavement model as
Right.
part of their economic social structure?
That's the question.
Yeah, and I don't know. But the answer for a lot of cultures like Numenor is yeah. Right? In the real world.
In the real world.
Yeah.
Whether it's explicit slaves or like economic exploitation.
Yeah,
the-
and
I mean, you can also see the World Cup stadiums in Qatar that were just built last year.
what about
2
them?
years ago.
What about them?
They were built with a lot of imported labor,
Oh yeah.
and that labor, those people were not treated well. A lot of people died.
Sure. And let's also just bring it back to the U.S. We got people in penitentiaries making stuff.
There you go.
Out on the highway working.
Yep. So I have a couple more quotes that I want to mention with Numenor before we move on. So Fellowship of the Ring, page 247. They say, the race of kings from over the sea, the great people, the men of the West. This is the great people versus on the next page referring to men as the big people. So the race of kings are inherently great. This is what we can take away. On page 274 of Fellowship, they were talking about the blood of the Numenorians became mingled with that of lesser men, implying that Numenorians are better than your average men. Also, you have the Dunedain, who are also descended from Numenor. They live much longer than quote-unquote lesser men.
Yes.
So there's like this genetic thing, a little problematic in my view. But
It's the genetic thing that's the problem because the reactionary counterpoint to all this stuff is like, it's a heroic novel, and so you need someone like Aragorn to be the vessel of our feelings of greatness and heroism, and he has to, by dint of him being a hero, he has to be in a minority position. He's unique. He's unique among men, right? That on a psychological, emotional, inspirational level isn't problematic until it becomes a genetic concern, genetic political concern. Like if all the characters are projections of our internal psyche, like I want to move from lesser man to great man. That's like the heroic influence that this book could have on me. But it could also have that's like the medicine I can take from this book. And the poison I can take from this book is that greatness is genetic and that it differentiates individual men from other men rather than the individual heroic me from the lesser me.
we also have a tendency, and this connects with an idea I got from a Hidden Brain episode about gender. This was years ago that it came out. I don't remember what it was, but I've recommended it to some students. But in that podcast, Hidden Brain, that episode, they were talking about Jamie Shute and the first non-binary person to be recognized as non-binary in Oregon on the driver's license, no gender assigned. So whatever that episode was, in it, they said something like, we often we assume that the way things are the way things are meant to be or should be.
Yeah.
So the way things are, like, Aragorn is good because he's genetically superior. Numenorians are better because they live longer, therefore they're better. Therefore, like, as a reader, maybe I take away that, well, the people in power are in power because they are superior.
Yes.
This is the way it should be. I'll just be complacent, compliant, unquestioning, and I'll just have them tell me what to do and give them all control and power.
Yeah, that's the psyop of
Right.
hierarchy in general.
There it is.
It's a trick being played by a minority on a majority. Yeah.
So the last quote for this, that I have for Numenorians, is a parallel to the mithril coat, and this is in the Two Towers, page 125. This is when they're going to Rohan. They're going into the Great Hall. They have to leave their weapons at the door. They go in. Gandalf says at one point when they're inside, he says, he's referring to the weapons that Legolas, Aragorn, Gimli have left outside with the guard. I'm not sure who he's talking to, one of the guards inside, one of the Rohirrim, men of Rohan. He says, weapons they have laid at your doors that are worth many a mortal man, even the mightiest. So again, there's this idea of like value and worth. Like this object is worth more than the lives and experiences of many men, even the mightiest of men.
And that's Gandalf again?
Gandalf
Man,
says
he's hung
this.
up on Mithril, huh? Is it Mithril?
It's not Mithril. This is Aragorn's sword that was reforged. This is the sword that was broken. Elendil? Is that what it is?
Elendil.
Heir of Elendil.
Yeah, I thought you said Elendil's a person.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Elendil's
Elendil's a person. What the hell is the name of the sword?
Yeah, I know the sword's got a name.
It's got a name. Whatever that name is, it's not coming to me. Like that sword, Legolas's bow that was given from Galadriel, dwarven axes,
Narsil?
shards of Narsil, but it's reforged and has a different name.
Does it really? Okay.
Yes.
He renames it. That's funny.
Gotta get a...
Osiris got to stay Osiris when he got put back together.
We're going to do a text
Don't
check
do
here.
it. Don't do it.
Are you ready for the answer? Andoril.
Andoril is Narsil?
Andoril is... Narsil was broken and was reforged into Andoril.
Word.
So those are my quotes. The last
It's
quotes I have
interesting to me that Gandalf is so hung up on equating metals to human lives and worth. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, and they're both Gandalf. What's up with that, Gandalf? Why so capitalistic? Why so...
Yeah, why is he so into
Materialistic.
Why is he so into stuff? Maybe he's just delighted that stuff exists because he's he's in an incarnation. Okay, so I want to mention this one thing that we've mentioned before on the probably on the evil episode, and it's a scene from the Two Towers, and I think it highlights Númenorian supremacy and the notion that Númenorian men are ordained to rule over the indigenous people of Middle-earth. But it's going to pivot us into kind of broad global racial, especially in the West, like complexion stuff, like white supremacy stuff, European supremacy stuff, specifically in contrast to Africa, Asia, the so-called New World, non-European nations.
Melanin,
yeah. Two Towers, Ballantyne's 395. They're at the crossroads. Frodo sees, quote, beyond an arch of boughs, the road to Osgiliath running almost as straight as a stretched ribbon down into the west. There, far away, beyond sad Gondor, now overwhelmed in shade, the sun was sinking, finding at last the hem of the great slow-rolling pall of clouds, and falling in an ominous fire toward the yet unsullied sea. The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath. The years had gnawed it, and violent hands had maimed it. Its head was gone, and in its place was set in mockery a round, rough-hewn stone, rudely painted by savage hands in the likeness of a grinning face with one large red eye in the midst of its forehead. Upon its knees and mighty chair, and all about the pedestal, were idle scrawls mixed with the foul symbols that the maggot folk of Mordor used. We've been through that quote before, and that giant stone figure is presumably a Númenorian king or a Gondor king. It says it's like the kings of Argonath, right? What I just read, and I don't profess to know this stuff, but during one of the breaks, I was looking in Robert Foster's guide, and Argonath is Stones of the Kings, the carved rocks at the upper end of the chasm at the northern entrance to Nen Hithoel on Anduin, the two immense and awesome statues of Isildur and Anarion. Viewers of the film will know this, I'm sure. The two giant statues on the Anduin.
yeah.
So this statue is
arms outright, like stretched out in as like saying stop.
I
And
guess
think in
yeah.
the books they have axes, I believe.
This statue is like those, but not the same.
Yeah.
But either way, so this is an artifact of a colonizer state. Someone showed up and said, this type of person is the king here. And they created a giant statue to remind the world of who the Supreme was. I'm also reminded of the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I don't know if you know that poem, but we don't need to recite the whole thing right here, but traveler in the desert sees this broken down statue all destroyed, and the irony is that at the bottom of the statue it says, I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Ozymandias statue is meant to signal that Ozymandias' reign is supreme and eternal. And it's been broken down by time in the poem, and in this scene, broken down presumably by orcs, or maybe men, people in the region adjacent to Mordor, aligned with Sauron, who chose to decapitate the statue. We're seeing similar things happen in the U.S., right? Where statues are being torn down, removed.
Yeah.
And because they're regarded as symbols of supremacy, right?
Right.
And so they're being removed democratically. I guess you could argue that it's a conspiracy or whatever, but in some cases, people are roping them down. The book that we're talking about, The Lord of the Rings, presents that as a real defamation of a divinely ordained ruler. But from our contemporary 2023 perspective, it feels a little bit more like a democratic decision to take down a statue. Does that make sense? The book depicts the enemies of the statue are the bad guys in this book.
I mean, they're the maggot folk. They're also referred to as savages.
Yeah,
savage hands,
Yep.
and like crudely painted mockery.
Yep.
So it's mockery. It's crudely painted. It's not meant as it's not portrayed as a parody. It's prevented.
What do you mean it's not portrayed as a parody?
It's not called this is a parody of the statue that was. This is mockery.
Yeah, it sounds like they did kind of parody it by putting a new head on.
Right,
but,
so it could be parody, which is more of an art form, but mockery is less acceptable.
And mockery is also the perspective of the colonizer. Like, why are you mocking me?
Right. So there's this nuanced part. Like, this is going back to R.F. Kuang, and the complexity of this book is that Tolkien he's presenting this as how terrible is this? Maybe this is terrible that it was defaced in mockery of the statue. But he also admits that the statue has been worn down with time. So it's already kind of on its way out.
In decline.
Right.
Yeah.
It's in decline. So I want to read, speaking of that thing of time, I want to read from The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark, one of my favorite riddles that Gollum says. This thing all things devours, birds, beast, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountain down.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like, so what I'm trying to convey here is that Tolkien seems to carry into the vision of Middle-earth accidentally, I don't know that it's intentional per se or whatever, a notion that the colonized are savage.
Yep.
And that they're dangerous, and when they act autonomously, it's degraded. It degrades the conditions of living for everyone.
Yeah.
And what you just pointed out with that other quote is that he seems to also have an acceptance that beauty is fleeting, and there's a sunset to empire, and things end. So that's interesting that he can accept the dominance of time, or the ultimate.
You're going to say the supremacy of time.
I was about to say the supremacy of time, but he can't accept the supremacy of democracy or whatever, right? Like when the people tear down the statue, it's vulgar and it's something to be stopped. But when time tears down everything, that's just the kind of melancholy tragedy of life.
C'est la vie, hein?
Good.
I want to talk about the idea of art. I went to art school. I studied art history. Part of art history, there's this whole thing called primitive art. Mm-hmm. And it's called primitive, and usually it's looking at African art, art of like the third world or whatever, and maybe it's like rustic, maybe it's whatever, but it's presented as like, oh, this is primitive, it's not as refined, it's not as good. So like there's something inherently troubling about about the presentation. There's a good piece that I really appreciate from John Oliver in last week's Night about museums, and they have gone and they have taken art, statues, etc., from places that they've colonized, places that they've conquered, and they've done that like pretty explicitly. They've taken over places with military might to take their artistic artifacts. They've got like bronzes from a place in Africa, which they're beautiful, and they're like, oh, I love, these are wonderful, these are great. Like how wonderful are they? We're taking care of them, and the countries are like, give these things back. And they're even doing it with Greece. They took most of them. The country's like, can you give those back, please? And they're like, no. I mean, they took a lot of things from Egypt.
And one of the curators' argument being, we need to see evidence from you that you will take as good care of these statues as we do. Right. And that's the ultimate parent state notion of empire and colonialism.
They were interviewing some people about this, and one person explicitly said, referring to the sculptures from the Parthenon in Athens, and there's this wonderful Athens, the Acropolis Museum, where there's this whole recreation of like scale model of the Acropolis, where you can see the bas-relief carvings, and a lot of places just have a plaster copy because the original's in the Imperial Museum in England. And this person who was interviewed said, well, we would return these, or like, we're not going to return these until like, because they can't take care of their own works. They don't know what they have, and we're taking better care of them than they do. And that was just like, oh, excuse me. That's very much like, we know what's best.
Yeah, and those notions might come after a historical or political notion of supremacy, right? The precondition for such a thinking could be the English are superior to the blank.
Right.
And therefore,
the rest
the
of the
way
world.
we do things is better. So for example, because statues aren't necessary. This is hard to talk about. It is a person's choice, a people's choice, what they want to do with their national art. If they want to transform it, if they want to let it decay, if they want to tear it down, if they want to enshrine it, an invader doesn't make those aesthetic choices.
And there's also ISIS has also taken over places, and they have willingly just destroyed statues from history, like thousands year old statues. They've just destroyed it because they're like, these are icons, these are things that you should not worship, these should not exist.
It's interesting. It's interesting because that what you just said could be used as an argument for colonial action by the West in, like the MENA region, because look at these people are going to destroy their own statues.
Right.
If we don't invade and
So we need to invade and like take over and kill people to preserve these statues.
So and in Middle Earth, the point is the orcs and the wild men in the Mordor region, they just can't they can't appreciate art. Although it's possible Frodo can't appreciate their art because they didn't ask for the statue of the Númenórean king to be planted there. What they did was tear its head off and replace it with something else.
Right.
Which is going to happen. That's what people do. People do stuff like that with community art. That's
sure.
So we talked about it before. There's echoes of the graffiti concern here too. Idle scrawls, right? The notion that the poor person's art, which is an act of artistic will imposed on a surface that was not asked for. I did not ask for concrete to be here. That is evil, and good is whatever the colonizer state puts up and does. To destroy an oil refinery is an act of sabotage and terrorism, but to put up to to destroy an ecosystem locally with an oil refinery,
To run a pipeline through
right.
sacred land.
Yeah, that's an act of tech of the colonizer.
I mean,
state.
it's necessary tech. Who cares about your sacred land? We need this oil to run.
right. It's
So,
self-ordained. It
If,
doesn't.
like if it and it, maybe it breaks and goes into your water supply, but whatever, you're not important people.
Yeah, the colonizer needs no justification in order to put a statue up. But the colonized, in this particular case, would seem to need, no defense at all is going to exonerate them for tearing the head off the statue and replacing it with something else.
Right.
Okay. In that quote, the maggot people and vermin, there's no vermin in that quote, but those are just classic exterminationist characterizations of the other in our world. We see that language over and over again. So Tolkien's use of maggot here is really reminiscent of ways that people historically have referred to other people when they think of them as lesser and capable of being exterminated, because maggots are a thing that humans tend to exterminate or try to keep away from themselves. In Middle-earth, there's a massive problem with certain kinds of people being understood as not having any rights and needing to be exterminated or removed or confined. And those are mostly orcs, right? We're going to talk about orcs as people in this episode.
Yep.
And also
They have consciousness.
Yep. And they speak several of them are bilingual, right? They speak common
And they speak their
and
own
they speak
orcish tongue.
the black tongue, right? Is that what it's called, or is that
I thought
Orcish
the
is
black
different
tongue
than
was
yeah,
like
okay.
what they
Orcish.
speak.
They speak Orcish.
Could be
some of them
it's
might
what
be
they speak in
trilingual,
Mordor.
and some of them,
But it is referred that the black tongue is referred to as uncouth.
yeah, they're crafty people. They're not. They're pretty close to elves and dwarves and all of them in terms of cognition.
Yeah.
Okay, so
They're
yeah.
there.
And even the notion that they're dumber is part of a supremacy model, right?
Right.
Because there's no evidence on the ground of that. There's just a notion that we could defend. That, orcs are... Right. Anyways, it doesn't just apply to orcs. It applies to the Easterlings,
Mhm.
and more specifically to the Southrons, the
Okay.
Haradrim, the
Yep.
cruel Haradrim, as it were. And it's unfortunate, but it is the deal that othering of those people, in contrast to the Númenorian men and the elves, is pigmentation. Right, the orcs are widely regarded as dark-skinned, and so are the Haradrim, and that leans on long-standing notions in Tolkien's world and in my world of a white supremacy model versus a black other. And I want to ground that in a couple real world things, and then talk about how it shows up in Middle Earth. So, you've read The Great Gatsby?
I read it once, yeah, outside of school.
This character, a distasteful character named Tom Buchanan in chapter 2, who casually mentions this racist thing that he's pursuing academically. He's like, have you read this book, The Rise of the Colored Empires, by this man Goddard? And it's a book about how the so-called Nordic races have to. This is like 1925, right? When the book is being published, it takes place in I think 1920, 1921.
Yeah, Roaring 20s.
1922 maybe. I should know off the top of my head. It's a high point for eugenics and for racism, I would say, in Europe and in America. The notion of this fictional book is that the so-called Nordics are the creators of high civilization, and they have to defend the planet against a rising tide of people of color. That book that's fictional inside The Great Gatsby is modeled on a book from real life called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. That's a book from 1920 by a guy named Lothrop Stoddard. So Goddard's Rise of the Colored
Stoddard
Empires.
instead of Goddard.
Yeah. It's an illusion, basically.
Yeah, very
it's
close.
almost like maybe he was afraid of libel. Like maybe Fitzgerald is anxious about libel in the book, and that's why he
It's like
changed his
calling
name.
alluding to Facebook, but you can't say Facebook, so you say friend face.
Sure, yeah, right. Anyways, I haven't read The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, so I don't know what it is. But it reminds me of this other thing that Carl Jung claims that Sigmund Freud said to him in 1910. When they were starting to fall out and Carl Jung starting to drift away from Freud, Freud says to him, promise me never to abandon, the quote that I got from the New York Times is that he said, promise me never to abandon the sexual theory, namely my teachings, Freud's teaching about the nature of the subconscious. Don't abandon it. I guess in favor of like an archetype theory or like a spiritual theory. Jung reports Freud saying, we must make a dogma of it, an unshakable bulwark. And then Jung asked, a bulwark against what? And Freud says, against the black tide of mud of occultism. His point being, plausibly or ostensibly, that we have to uphold the sexual theory of subconscious against the tide, like a occultism. He's anxious that like a spiritism or a notion of like a notion of divinity or some other thing that's kind of not sciencey is going to creep in, and that's like a scientific concern. But the language he uses is initially the black tide of mud, and it so for Freud, this is a dude who, you know, he's trying to talk about how when people say things, they're kind of saying something else. His anxiety is remarkably similar to the rising tide of color against white world supremacy. This black tide of mud and all the, like what you referred to earlier as primitive art and like primitivism, this anxiety of, what's the like this atavistic thing, this anxiety that Europe and empire has that it's going to turn back into the thing that it's trying to make other. And that is in the 20th century, in the 19th century for Europeans, that other is Asia and Africa and the indigenous New World, right? I think.
Okay, sure. So this is also, I think Kendi talks about this in Stamped from the Beginning, but there are also direct parallels in Lord of the Rings where there's that association with like the word black with bad things, and we use the word black for people of color. Fellowship of the Ring, it's black like, page 84 is black like, 85 is black chap. They're smelling, this is othering. On page 115, black figures, this is all black for the Nazgul, black riders versus Gandalf, who's a hero, who's the white rider. Page 176, there's a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow. So we're talking about like,
we'll get back at him
right.
in a minute. Yeah.
So these things are coming up. Sauron has a black staff. Gandalf has a white staff. These are words, and I think Kendi in his book refers to like uses the word blackguard, which is spelled blackguard.
Blackguard, right?
Right. So that's someone who's not good. You don't like a blackguard. You blackguard. You bad person. You.
Right.
So it's like those associations become maybe some conscious, inherent.
Yeah. And the
Freudian
notion that
slips.
and the notion that we have to create a bulwark. So Freud uses that word bulwark against a black tide of mud,
Right.
of occultism.
But
right?
you know what? A student gave me the phrase years ago, no mud, no lotus.
Yeah, you used that on this podcast recently. I've been
Yeah.
thinking a lot about that. That's an essential notion to being healthy.
Sweet is sweeter with a bite of the bitter as well.
So let me just finish this bulwark thing. Because on page 322 of the Fellowship of the Ring in the Council of Elrond, this is Boromir. He says, "Believe not that in the land of Gondor the blood of Númenor is spent, nor all its pride and dignity forgotten. By our valor the wild folk of the east are still restrained, the terror of Morgul kept at bay, and thus alone are peace and freedom maintained in the lands behind us, bulwark of the west." Gondor is the bulwark of the west, the thing that stands between the black tide of mud and high civilization. And it's what's curious is that he has the gall to use the words peace and freedom as the thing to describe the thing that they're defending. and their defense of it is through continual antagonism of potentially of a majority population, right?
Potentially a majority population of orcs, Southrons, Easterlings.
Yeah, and wild men even, right? Like that's pretty much everyone but a citizen of Gondor. And
The wild men who live in the mountains between Rohan
Yeah.
and Gondor.
I haven't done a census, right? So I
Right.
can't say who's in a minority or who's in a majority.
Right, it's
I can-
unknown.
but I can say that our definitions have said that colonialism and the colonial mindset depends on a minority rule of a majority population. That's
I mean,
inherent
it's not really unknown because Mordor and like the allies, there are hosts and hosts of them.
Yeah.
And Mordor can afford to lose a host more easily than Gondor can afford to lose a company.
Yeah. And Boromir speaks not as a Gondor citizen, but as the son of the steward, right? He wouldn't even know if the people in his own city felt peace and freedom. That's pure ideology.
Because he's not living that life.
He's privileged. I
Right.
mean, yeah, and he's got a lot of responsibilities, right?
He is the 1%.
Yeah. And
And
he
the
and his dad
stewards-
still find things to complain about, you know?
Right, so the stewards are also essentially the rulers of Gondor for years, generations, who knows how long, going
Yep.
back till Isildur or whenever the king departed. I'm assuming that's like Isildur's time. But the stewards know that they're not the king, but they are the rulers. Mm-hmm. But they're also living with this anxiety that maybe the king will come back one day. But even in the realm of Gondor, you could be a steward for 10,000 years and not be king.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about the Black Tongue and a little bit about the Haradrim. And then I think we should talk about women.
Okay.
So Gandalf again at Elrond's place. 333 Valentine's Fellowship of the Ring. He pronounces the what the ring says. Ashnags, they're about to look. Ashnags, right? He
Right.
pronounces that out loud, and it says the change in the wizard's voice was astounding. Suddenly, it became menacing, powerful, harsh as stone. A shadow seemed to pass over the high sun, and the porch for a moment grew dark. All trembled, and the elves stopped their ears. Never before has any voice dared to utter words of that tongue in Imladris, Gandalf the Grey, said Elrond, as the shadow passed and the company breathed once more. And let us hope that none will ever speak it here again, answered Gandalf. Nonetheless, I do ask your pardon, Master Elrond, for if that tongue is not soon to be heard in every corner of the West, then let all put doubt aside that this thing is indeed what the wise have declared, the treasure of the enemy, fraught with all his malice, and in it lies a great path of his strength of old. If that tongue is not soon to be heard in every corner of the West, his point being, you're going to hear that language all over the place if you don't act appropriately and according to my recommendations right now to destroy this ring and pursue this path. That is troublingly similar to things I hear people say about language in general, like languages that aren't English in the United States, or just like foreign languages as perceived by people who don't speak more than one language.
So
I'm thinking of Spanish.
Yep.
And the anxiety that I'm aware white folks, European folks, English speakers can feel when they're surrounded by people speaking Spanish. Because it starts to seem like this country once was full of people speaking English, and now all of a sudden, like, if you don't start making if you don't put up a bulwark,
if we don't
at
put
the
up a
board-
wall, if
at
we
the
don't build a border
right,
wall,
or there's laws that require indoctrination and a set of dogma, and it doesn't have to be Spanish. It can be, I think it's Arabic. And Chinese are often subject to the same anxieties, and even the dialect of English that is sometimes called African American vernacular, the influence of African American vernacular, or what used to be called Ebonics,
Yep.
on the American population at large, is a source of anxiety to people sometimes. And it's just interesting that the language as a scary otherer is echoed, the way that it happens in the real world is echoed in the book. I think that's interesting that Gandalf makes that point explicit. You don't want to hear more of that language, do you? Then you better...
Well, then we got to put up hundreds of miles of border wall because
Right.
like they're coming in.
You got to put your foot
coming
down.
in all over the place. Yep, that thing. It also, as you read that, and it made me think of the language is like, oh, it sounds bad, and they stop theirs and like, oh, it sounds yucky. What a yucky sounding language. I think that's often been said about the German language.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear someone speaking German, you're like, oh, that sounds harsh and yucky, and ooh, that's gross. But like, do we think that's the case because of this leftover notion of World War II where Germans were the enemy?
Yeah, in English speaking, for speakers of English, it could go even deeper than that because English and German are, this is just
We might also think
speculation that's not.
might also think that
visible
Russian sounds harsh and uncouth.
here. Your
Like, is this
point-
because
yeah.
we're like geopolitical enemies, or there has been that enmity in history or recent history?
The point being, a supremacy model precedes the application of it precedes the specific application. You could apply a supremacy model to anything and say, us equals good, they equals bad.
Right.
I don't like the way their language sounds. I don't like the way their skin looks. And from a colonial perspective, that's a matter of retaining a bulwark, right? And separating a minority of rulers from a majority, lest there be contamination or pollution, which really, in democratic terms, might be more like cooperation. What's the word?
Like
that
diluting the blood with that of lesser men, diluting
Yes.
the language or pure, beautiful language.
Osterhamel again, rejecting cultural compromises with the colonized population. The colonizers are convinced of their own superiority and their ordained mandate to rule. The bulwark exists so that the minority can retain a sense of an ordained mandate. The ordained mandate is the minority position that's uncontaminatable, and without that, we're going to have to deal with democracy or anarchy or whatever.
Yeah. So then, like
Or-
that,
yeah.
bringing that quote of like compromise specific to language, I think of a movie that was made years ago called Spanglish, where it's Spanish and English combined, and like Spanish is native to many cities in this country, and people grow up speaking Spanish. L.A., for example, loads of people speak Spanish in L.A. They speak other languages in cities around this country, just so like those exist. And our country, the United States, does not have an official language.
Mm-hmm.
There is like English is not officially the language of this country.
And the push, which has never been successful, to federalize a national language or whatever, seems to be driven by a supremacist notion that the English language is superior to other languages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though anyone who learns English or any foreign language teacher will tell you like English is confusing.
Yeah, and also anyone who loves English will tell you that the language is by its nature fully permeable. It's very open to it takes in any word, it naturalizes any word or phrase. It just gobbles up other languages. It's like a melting pot.
So you're saying like
It's not a melting pot. It's
so
like a
so it
tossed salad.
changes, it evolves,
The language evolves, and
dead ass
but it does that by absorbing things from other
On
languages.
moms? On Ja? For reals?
I want to get at one more thing about white supremacy or Eurocentrism, and that is the function of Orientalism in this book. And I don't want to get dragged down or bogged down in definitions of Orientalism, and I am in the process right now of reading Edward Said's classic text, Orientalism. My understanding of Orientalism is that it's a tendency for the so-called West, like Europe in particular, to define itself in contradistinction to an other that is basically the East, and to generalize Eastern cultures and to romanticize them, sometimes sinister, in a sinister way, but not always, in a generalized way. Easy example being Disney's Aladdin. It's all mixed up. India, Arabia, all the same thing, right? Jewels, mystery, magic, genies in a bottle, the pants, and the swords. So the evidence of Orientalism and an anxiety about, and so that and Orientalism has its roots in like probably the Crusades, and also in a notion of like a Mongol horde or an empire in the East that's incomprehensible to Europeans. Orientalism in this book, in the specific reference to orcs and the men of Harad as carrying scimitars, yeah?
Yeah, and the two towers, like page 6, they're talking about the scimitars, which are usual to orcs.
And I think from my experience, I associate curved swords almost exclusively with Orientalist depictions of bandits, Oriental bandits.
And I associate it with like people in the Middle East.
That being the Orient in my generalized Orientalist reading of that symbology, right? Curved sword equals the other. Straight sword equals Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the other being non-Europe.
Yeah, but specifically the East.
Right.
Everything east of Constantinople /
East, Middle East,
Istanbul,
Arabia, all of that.
Yeah, the line of scrimmage.
The line of scrimmage.
Yeah, I often think of European late Middle Age, I guess, politics as being the line of scrimmage being Constantinople / Istanbul.
Okay.
You know what I mean? The seat of the Western Empire until it's sacked and taken by the Turks.
Right. Which was it was the capital of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Constantinople was moved from Rome to Constantinople. There were 2 capitals, then there were like 4 emperors, the tetrarchy, the tetrarchs.
Whoa, yeah. Anyways, way later, Constantinople
becomes Istanbul.
Yeah, and that's traditionally sort of the line, I think, where like the Crusades and such.
It's like a launching point for those.
No, it's the line where you cross over into the East to Europeans.
Not a launching point, but like forward operating base.
Maybe, yeah. It gets a little tricky talking about the Crusades because like European Crusaders sacked Constantinople on their way to Jerusalem. They were so like they were already in the East as far as they were concerned, probably. But yeah, I think like European Christendom, archetypally or historically, in terms of generalities, regards everything east of Constantinople as the East.
Yep.
Even though it's much more diverse than that, right? So I see that same reduction in.
That's what we're referring to, like all those things as Orientalism. That's what you mean.
Orientalism
like
is
Orientalism. All of these things, everything east
the tendency
of this
to do that is Orientalism,
Orient.
right? Yeah.
Versus
the
these
Occident.
cultures, all these different thoughts, everything.
Yeah, it's all mixed up in the imagination of the European mind. Sure.
Sort of like the thought or the idea of like being Asian now. There's like you might think of Asian as like China, Japan, etc. But like people are like, well, Philippines is like the Philippines are also in Asia. India is also Asia. So like everyone there is Asian.
Vastly different cultures.
Vastly different.
Right. And the only thing that they have in common really is that from a certain vantage point, they're to the east.
Right.
And that they're not. They're curved swords and we are straight swords. I hate to keep being like I don't hate, but it's embarrassing to keep saying things like to the European mind. I don't speak as a European, right? I speak as someone who's descended of Europeans.
So what? You're like Gondor, descended from the Numerians?
I'm lesser men. Okay, so and the Haradrim, that's the men of the Harad, and I don't have any quotes to back this up, but those dudes are obviously, to me, they're obviously like Middle Eastern caricatures.
Caricatures.
Yeah, in the book, the Haradrim are caricatures of like Muslim army type dudes.
Okay, I would. Your use of the word caricature is what I'm, I guess, balking at because, like, yes, I see the parallels of Muslim army, but I'm not. Caricature is like so I feel a caricature is so much embodying a character that it's like almost comical, and I'm not getting that sense from.
Well, the Haradrim are a vast reduction of the realities of all
Caricature
the
as,
Eastern people, like the the North Africans, the Arabians, the Asians, the Southeast Asians. Those are all kind of bound together in a notion of the cruel Haradrim.
Right. So
these brown
I'd say,
men from the South who have a different sensibility than us, curved swords,
yeah,
and brown skin,
yeah,
and elephants, right?
yeah. Well,
in that
Oliphants,
sense, in that sense,
technically.
yeah, in that sense, they're caricatures of a real geopolitical reality in history for for Europeans.
All right, cool. Thanks for the explanation.
And again, I don't have any quotes to support it, but we've kind of been through it a bit with the Haradrim.
Yeah, and there's one part about that I don't have the quote either, but I remember that talking about the battle scene, and I guess it's on the Pelennor Fields where there's going to be another charge, and it talks about the sun glittering off of all the curved scimitars, and there's like it was described beautifully, like this beautiful like glittering army, this armies that's there, like it seemed like the way Tolkien described it, there was definite beauty to it.
That's the thing, is there's a fascination to Orientalism.
Yeah.
A lot of that you see in the way the Greeks and the Romans speak of Egypt.
Because it's like there's an exoticism.
Yeah, it's exoticized. Yep.
Yeah, and that's also like thinking of belly dancers that are like, oh, these exotic people. There's also could be like an eroticism to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Again with Egypt. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that is also the black tide of mud of occultism. You're going to go to Egypt and you're going to quote go native. You're going to start worshiping multiple gods and goddesses. You're going to start doing magic. You're going to come back wearing perfume with incense and and coal on your eyelids.
Doing yoga.
Yeah. Right, and that stuff is fascinating to the austerity of the colonizer state.
I
It's
remember
the fascination that the mind has for the body, frankly. And it's time to chill. Speaking of Freud or whatever, like it's time to just chill and accept the realities of the body and stop projecting it onto a geopolitical space when in my opinion, it's a psycho-emotional condition.
So there are two things of like the idea of the curved scimitar, that two references in, I guess, pop culture, cinematic culture, that I wanted to mention. One is the movie Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom. This came out in early 2000s. At one point, there's some Christian crusaders, whatever. They're attacking a caravan, and I remember, so they're charging down like people on horses, like civilians undefended. And I remember seeing this one guy with a turban, a shield, and a curved sword, like standing by himself, essentially, like to defend the people from being slaughtered against like this overwhelming attacking force. And I remember being like, there's valor there. That's courage. That's valor to stand up. I also remember the movie Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where Morgan Freeman plays a Moor with a curved sword. Kevin Costner is Robin Hood, and at some point in the movie, they mentioned like one person defending his home, and I think they were talking about the places that they sacked. But one person defending his home is worth like 10 paid soldiers or 10 crusaders in it for something else.
You're talking about supremacist valorization of the last standing resistor to the empire?
Maybe.
That's interesting, isn't it?
I'm just seeing like these
Crazy Horse.
things are...
Crazy Horse is the same way. Geronimo. Yeah, that's a thing. That's like a tokenization of or like it's like making a specimen of, right? The noble savage.
Yeah.
Making a specimen of something that is slated for destruction.
I think of Basquiat again.
How so?
Basquiat died at like age 27. So like he was this token black guy in white New York artist culture, and he was slated for destruction.
Whew, that's grim. Is this a good time? I mean, it's kind of a natural transition into the women question, the woman question. The what did I call it? I called it the missing women theory. Speaking of slated,
Hashtag Entwives.
yeah,
Entwives. What about regular wives?
right.
There's only one wife in the whole trilogy.
Rosie?
Rosie.
No, Galadriel's also married.
Oh, Galadriel's married. Lobelia Baggins is married.
Yep. So we can count the women, and we should do that. But I want to set up this notion first that the missing women theory to me is that we have this thing in the Two Towers where, what's his face? Fanghorn? What's his other name? Treebeard. Treebeard says, we male Ents lost our Ent wives. Was the deal that they went out and when they came back, the Ent wives were gone? We don't need to look it up, but they're looking for them.
Maybe
the women were there, and now they're missing, and that is a curious and I'm guessing unconscious projection of a problem that Tolkien has allowed to happen in his fantasy world. He's allowed it to be largely devoid of female characters, and the only time that that's acknowledged is vicariously through the Entwife situation.
Yeah, I feel like Tolkien does that. There are these issues or things that are like eyebrow raising or problematic, but then he'll address them in small ways, sort of like Numenorian supremacy, and then he'll say like there'll be Athelas or Kingsfoil, which is this like it's named after a king, but it's also a weed, like this humble thing.
Right.
There's Strider being like I am, of course, the right, true and rightful king, but I'm going to introduce myself as Strider, and I want you, Frodo, to take me as I am, and to like have merit rather than say I am king.
Right, to earn one's merit rather than to just present the papers.
Right, so it's like this underlying this underlying problematic stuff, and then it's addressed in these small little ways.
Or excused.
Maybe
right.
That's the move to innocence.
Right.
There.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. So I agree. The thing with the Entwives is a little different in that he's not explaining the absence of women in the book. He's like saying, oh, in an unrelated tangent, the Entwives are missing. Mm-hmm. As if there aren't all the women missing in general, right? Like, well, it's curious, says Merry and Pippin, like, what do you mean the women are missing? Haven't you noticed, Merry and Pippin, as inhabitants of the world? Or like, I don't know. It's a little parable that applies to the larger world.
Yeah.
So let's count the women that we know. We did this earlier at breakfast, and I feel
they're
my
all,
apologies to any of the women in Middle Earth that we failed to identify.
Because they're not many, and they're all minor characters.
Relatively, right.
Relatively
Sometimes they wield
characters.
great power, but they're not heroes in the book.
And we're not going to mention the ones that are in song that are like...
We're going to avoid, Beren and Luthien, rather.
Nimronel or whatever.
Okay,
we're not
so
those.
Galadriel.
Éowyn. Éowyn's maybe the most on stage.
Yep, she is heroic. She's the token female hero.
And she fears a cage, which is nice.
Yeah.
Like, nice that that's brought up.
It is. So that's like what you were talking about with the excusal. Like, to excuse the sexism in this book, we've got to acknowledge that this one character has feminist impulses.
Right.
So
she makes
therefore,
up for it.
yeah, exactly.
Moves to innocence,
right.
Maybe.
Okay, Arwen.
That's who is very, very much not.
Yep, written.
Present.
If I remember correctly, she's given a larger role in the film version.
The films.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's like she almost was at Helm's Deep fighting in the
Sure.
films, and they cut that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Goldberry.
I'm not sure if Goldberry has any lines. I don't recall. Maybe one or two.
Okay.
Rosie,
the
Hobbit that Sam ends up marrying.
Yep. And then
Lobelia Sackville Baggins.
And I feel like we're starting to get into characters that don't really count, but at least they are represented. Lobelia, she's villainous but also redeemable.
Yep, she has a redemptive part at the end.
And that's not necessarily tied to her gender expression. And then I have also mentioned Shelob.
There's
as a female
there's
character.
There's in the Houses of Healing.
Yep, there's the Mistress of the Houses of Healing.
She has a name. Oh, here we go. Pure. I just opened to page 137. Pure Blood. There's your more supremacy.
I thought you were going to say that was
Great.
her name.
Pure Blood.
And her name was Pure Blood. Fairer than snow was she.
We didn't mention the immortality of
R.F.
elves.
Kuang. R.F. Kuang in her speech, she says sometimes people think that what she's writing is, like woke anti-white propaganda. And she says, "Reader, my crime is looking the way I look and having a protagonist who doesn't look like Aragorn, son of Arathorn."
Eorith. No, yeah, Eorith.
Eorith is the Mistress of the Houses of Healing.
Eorith is the one, she's the head nurse, maybe? Head doctor,
And
head
she
leech.
takes a lot of flack from Aragorn and from the narrator in terms of being ignorant.
And Gandalf.
Yeah, and that's not our point here. That these women are all ditzy blonde stereotypes. The point is that they don't exist. In a cast of thousands, maybe 1,000, that we have 8, right?
One of whom is a spider.
One of whom is a spider monster.
Spider monster.
Yep. And we might have missed some. And also, if we're going to say a cast of thousands, then we're not talking about only characters that walk on stage. None of our protagonists are female. And this is, it's also just a matter of perspective. I was saying earlier, too, before we were on mic, war movies and war stories, all the characters are male, and that's not because there's not women back in the U.S. or whatever, but like the soldiers in those stories are men because that's who was drafted.
Right.
And they're like this is maybe, and I don't feel confident speaking about Tolkien's biography, but he is a veteran of the First World War.
Yeah.
And so he did have a real broed out experience.
Yep.
So I don't fault him. I just want to recognize that there's something missing from the world.
The Endwives.
The Endwives.
And the regular wives. By regular, I mean human, dwarf, and elf.
And orcish.
And orc.
The orcish wives are conspicuously missing. The
are there
dwarf
orcish wives? Because
the
they're
dwarvish,
all spawned.
the dwarven wives
they're
are
spawned and bred.
Yeah, right. That's why they're missing. Because
Sort of like
they're
chickens.
all males.
Sort of like chickens, you sex a chicken, and if it's a layer, you're gonna get rid of the males.
Yeah.
Because you just want the females.
Or in that Rick and Morty episode.
Never have I ever watched an episode of Rick and Morty.
Yeah, it's probably the wrong time in history to recommend it, but
Or SpongeBob or Phineas and Ferb.
I've never seen. Yeah, ditto me. Except maybe one episode of each of those, but yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Are you done with Supremacy? Or because I have one more thing
John,
I want to.
we are living it. We are not done with it. What are you talking about? Stupid question.
Are you? Because I got one more thing to say before we're done. Totally.
I mean, I do want to point out a parallel that I've seen, a word used for orcs that I've seen used for humans in this world, and it's the word apes. It's used in the Two Towers on page 53 and 151. So that word, I mean, especially like now, I'm sort of hyper aware of it being used. And it's used twice by Tolkien referring to orcs.
That they're ape-like?
They're referred to as apes.
Oh, as apes.
Not ape-like, apes.
Hmm.
There's orc-like. There's also like half-orcs. There's squint-eyed half-orcs. There's squint-eyed folk.
Well, so you say, okay, I wanted to get back to, that's one thing we missed, the squint-eyed foreigner. And that's kind of the last point I think I want to get at. Thanks for reminding me.
And it's
now,
like this,
why do you say half-orc?
that's mentioned. Page 187 of the Two Towers, squint-eyed is mentioned on that page, and so is half-orcs.
The Two Towers, you sure you're not in the Fellowship?
Two Towers, 187.
Okay. Because I've got squinty-eyed foreigner.
It's used
okay.
frequently.
So who's the half-orc in the Two Towers?
Down towards the bottom of the page. So they're talking about there were some others that were horrible, man-high, but with goblin faces, sallow, leering, squint-eyed.
Where?
Flotsam and Jetsam.
Okay, so this is like the leftover people who were inhabiting Orthanc after the Battle of Orthanc, Battle of Isengard.
I guess I just have it underlined. I don't have the
Yeah, it's all good. Go ahead.
goblin faces, sallow, leering, squint-eyed. Do you know they reminded me of that at once of that southerner at Bree?
Yeah.
Only he was not so obviously orc-like as most of these were. I thought of him too, said Aragorn. We had many of these half-orcs to deal with at Helm's Deep.
Right. Okay. That's vital on so many levels. One, that's probably the only time in the book that it refers to half-orcs. And half-orcs in the tabletop role-playing world is that's a whole situation.
Yeah.
There's half-orc, people are playing as half-orcs. It's a common character type. And the notion is it's just kind of embedded.
Even if it's a half-orc, is it half-orc, half-human?
It depends. But
At which point, it would assume that orcs and humans could breed together to create offspring.
Yeah, right. Now, that squint-eyed foreigner from Bree, I'm gonna read a paragraph from that scene. This is from the Sign of the Prancing Pony in the Fellowship, page 213 in the Ballantines. They're at the Prancing Pony, and it says... The men and dwarves were mostly talking of distant events and telling news of a kind that was becoming only too familiar. There was trouble away in the south, and it seemed that the men who had come up the Greenway were on the move, looking for lands where they could find some peace. And Bree folk were sympathetic, but plainly not very ready to take a large number of strangers into their little land. One of the travelers, a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow, was foretelling that more and more people would be coming north in the near future. If room isn't found for them, they'll find it for themselves. They have a right to live, same as other folk, he said loudly. The local inhabitants did not look pleased at the prospect.
I mean, that immediately makes me think of Europe and refugees going into the border, and that Bree would be Europe, the countries of Europe, not being unsympathetic, but they're like, we can't have all of you. We'll take some, but you got to move through. It's
almost a kind of a nuanced scene, because Tolkien doesn't say, he does refer to that guy as quarrelsome, and he says he's an uncouth fellow. Mm-hmm. So it's inherent in the narration that they're bad guys, right? But at least we get the depiction of the Breelanders as being sympathetic, but ultimately just unable to handle it emotionally. Or unwilling to handle it. What I find disturbing about it is the notion that this vaguely villainous character argues that people have the right to live.
Yeah. Because
that is a beautiful humanitarian notion, and a notion that binds people together. And it's ugly to me that it's presented as problematic. And so I think getting it back to sort of a colonization or supremacy mindset, the supremacy model rests on the idea that only some people have the right to live.
Yep.
Potentially a minority, because there's this big wave, right? Again, the tide. People are going to need a place to live. A place to live for people.
There's a lot of talk throughout the books of... it seems like people are very quick to be like, well, they deserve death, they should die. There's a lot of people being like, well, we should kill those people, they shouldn't die. Yes, Gollum deserves death, etc. There's a lot of that talk just thrown in very casually. It's a little discomforting. If you see it and notice it, it's discomforting how often and how casually it's thrown in. Mm-hmm. Because there's that, I'm thinking of that quote from Gandalf, deserves death. No doubt he does, but
right.
Just many who die deserve life. Can you give it to them?
Yep.
In that case, don't be so quick to deal out death.
Yeah. And again, I don't know anything about Tolkien's military background. But what I think I understand, and this is not to excuse, but to maybe explain a little bit of it, Tolkien lived in a world where, like if you refused to fight, you could be court-martialed for, desertion, and I think probably executed by your own state. I think an Englishman could be executed by commanding officers for desertion in World War I. I'm not sure. Do you know?
I think they got to that point, or they had the captain or the officer. They'd blow the whistle to charge no man's land. The men would go up first. The officer would follow, and the officer was charged to shoot anyone who turned back.
Sure. Right. So
just instantaneously. If you're an English officer and an English soldier is coming towards you, you shoot him.
So the right to life. My point being that the right to life is not. It's not as widely accepted. It's kind of orthodoxy for us right now that people have the right to live.
They do. It also seems to be like they have a right to live if they're not interfering with my life. You have a right to live, but like do it in your own space.
Yeah, the right to live is not to be confused with a right to like political agency. Yeah, and resources, material resources. I'm ready to bring this home.
I have one more quote that I missed about, I think, melanin. So going back to like the white-black thing. And it's very subtle, and I missed it reading through the first time, but this last time I've been listening to the books recently in preparation for this, and this one's like, I noticed it this time, and it's subtle. It feels very much like Supremacy. So this is sort of like, maybe this is also a challenge to the listener. Did you see this? Could you see this? If you see this here, can you see these subtle, implicit biases in the world? Do you say them yourselves? Do you do things like this? So this is of Herbs and Stewed Rabbit, page 299. I'm going to read a section of the paragraph, see if you can, it's going to hopefully be obvious at this point of the episode. The hobbits sat down again, but they said nothing to one another of their thoughts and doubts. Close by, just under the dappling shadow of the dark bay trees, 2 men remained on guard. They took off their masks now and again to cool them as the day heat grew. Frodo saw that they were goodly men, pale-skinned, dark of hair, with gray eyes and faces, and proud. They spoke together in soft voices, at first using the common speech, but after a man of older days, and then changing to another language of their own. What struck me as like very subtly, inherently supremacist, is Frodo saw that they were goodly men, pale-skinned. As it, like, pale skin is the first thing that's said. It's the physical appearance, and it is the skin primary to all that proves that they are goodly.
And it distinguishes them from the Haradrim,
Yep.
who are brown-skinned, dark-skinned men of Harad.
Who they will end up skirmishing with in the next few pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's that dead soldier that lies and then is like lies down face away from Sam. But like, where did he come from? What was his history? But then Sam gets caught up about marveling about an Oliphant. And like, oh, I saw this Oliphant. And he forgets about this dead soldier, this first person he's seen killed in war.
Yeah.
Doesn't faze him.
It's Orientalism kind of contracted to a really fine moment, like a really discrete moment. I was almost going to consider the deeper reality of this individual's identity. But look, an elephant.
Look at and over there through the trees are the slave quarters. But look at the architecture of this manor house. Oh, right, we don't have to think about that.
Okay, so with the fair man and with all this stuff, there's an ideology in this book of supremacy that I don't think is the point of the book. I think it's an accident, and I don't. It doesn't destroy the text. And we've spent a couple hours now extracting those specific ideological concerns.
It's sort of like the supremacy that's there, the models of supremacy are like this inherent side effect of the context of the world in which the book was written, the time period, the place, England, the West, etc.
Yeah. And some of this can also be, I think, tacked up to psychological shadow projection. Tolkien has characters in this book that are doing and saying things that he's imagining the other does because of a failure to, again, back to that. I really love that that Jürgen Osterhamel quote. A disinclination for cultural compromise, a preference for a model where like there's an other and it does that other thing and there is no communication betwixt us and them. I want to bring it back to R.F. Kuang, where I started with R.F. Kuang's lecture, because I want to talk about how even though we've spent a couple hours extracting all the worst and most embarrassing tendencies of this book, that's not the sum total of the project, right?
So you're implying that these things are bad and these are the worst parts.
They're the parts of it that are, yeah, I spoke of it earlier as poison versus medicine. The heroic ideology being a sort of medicine for the self.
It would be poison if the reader takes it and uses it. It affects the reader's mind.
Yeah, when you're in a certain condition,
reality,
when you're in a certain
world.
condition and you take a certain medicine, it can function as a poison, right? So if I'm in a position where I'm already pissed off that everyone in my people in my town are starting to speak this other language, and there's refugees, and like the color of the skin of the people I see every day is changing, and I don't understand why, like, these people are saying this thing on the media that I don't agree with, and I feel like the world is changing and slipping out of my control as a white man. If I'm in that condition, then the heroic ideology of this book might be a poison to me, because it might influence me to be more hateful and more like in the colonizer mindset of I'm in a minority position with a bulwark between me and a majority of types of people that I am afraid to synthesize with.
So this is you, like perhaps you have your own insecurities. You feel vulnerable, so you build a thick wall and you do not engage with these people.
Yeah. Plus, the colonizer is vulnerable.
Yeah,
because the colonizer is a minority.
Sort of like the shark is often the metaphor, like the shark versus the goldfish. The shark is, you act like a shark, you act tough, but you're actually very insecure.
Yeah, and I don't want to like downplay the advantage that colonizer states have had in terms of like weapons, biological warfare, and just
European disease.
Yeah, just power differentials that reduce the vulnerability of that minority position.
So the idea that R.F. Kuang was mentioning, that this is a chance to learn more about humanity, like literature. You can learn about humanity rather than looking at it as like as like propaganda.
Yeah.
Whereas like the heroic notion could be poisoned as propaganda, but maybe, or do you think, maybe I'll try and phrase that as a question. Do you think if the reader is able to starts to see these supremacy models within Middle Earth, within the story, that by doing it in a book that doesn't matter, like doesn't apply to the world, if we can see it within these pages, understand the context in which it was written, in which Tolkien was, then we can apply that to our current contemporary world, see it differently. And when we start to feel, as these characters felt, angry about like the dark language of Mordor, maybe we can take a moment and go, oh, like, what am I really feeling here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that could
I do
be,
think that by deconstructing the implied reality of the Middle-earth vision, we can start to deconstruct our own. We can use it as a tool to understand our own situation. Yeah. If Aragorn seems occasionally goofy to me, maybe I can start noticing when I am doing something that's a little goofy. Yeah, so let me bring it back to Kwong. So this is R.F. Kwong's lecture. I'm going to just give the name of that lecture again. R.F. Kwong's lecture, Goodness, Beauty, and Truth, the Value of Art in Times of Crisis. This is near the end of her lecture. She says this about Tolkien. No one could call The Lord of the Rings a silly morality tale. It succeeds because it is so rich, so fully imagined, so weird and wild and cool. It succeeds in part because Middle-earth feels truly realized, because Tolkien, combining the best of both his professions, employs appendices and textbook-like exposition and long digressions into ancient song and poems to convince us that this place really exists and has a history. And in making Middle-earth feel true, Tolkien has emphasized what is at stake and engaged the reader in the fight for its survival. So there's a lot more going on in this book than a supremacy model.
For sure.
And we will get back at that in episode 8. Although it'll probably come up again, right? Like we can't ignore, we've chosen not to ignore the way that supremacy has colored the text and the way that it mirrors supremacy models in our world.
Right. So we can get back episode 8, Stash Box
episode. Yeah.
And then episode 9 is the last